Okay, good evening, everyone. I have been asked by the safety and health officer of our university to make you aware in case we have an emergency. The emergency exits are up there and down here. In case we're getting flooded, you will find the life vest under your seat. Okay, I'm stopping here. I'm not sure if somebody wants to pull my leg, but now in case something is happening, you know. Okay, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second public lecture of WICN. My name is Stefan Böhm, and I'm the organizer of these events. WICN stands for the Wales Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. Thanks to the generous support from the Welsh Assembly government, researchers in the School of Psychology at Swansea, Cardiff, and Bangor University work together in the Wales Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience to investigate how the human mind arises from the human brain. WICN also makes this knowledge available to the public, hence, for example, public lectures as today. You might be interested to know that our public lectures are going to be recorded and will be made available later for watching our WICN website and on YouTube, for example. So just type in WICN public lectures, you will see it. And I think the latest talk we have is probably on top of it. So if you do it right now, you see David's talk from 2 weeks ago. So it's a great pleasure now to introduce today's speaker, Professor Oliver Turnbull. So Professor Oliver Turnbull is a neuropsychologist and a member of the School of Psychology. His scientific interests are in the neural basis of emotion and emotion-based decision making. Across the last 2 decades, he has published very widely. He's also the author of the very popular book, The Brain and the Inner World, that has been translated into more than a dozen languages. Professor Turnbull was head of the School of Psychology from 2007 to 2011, and then head of the College of Health and Behavioral Science. He is now Prof. Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning. Tonight, Professor Turnbull is talking about one of his favorite research topics, the representation of the human body and the brain. I think I forgot something, but we'll figure that out later. At the end of his talk, Professor Turnbull is happy to take questions and discuss with you about his research. So after his talk, if you have a question you would like to discuss something, please raise your hand and wait until we get a microphone to you so that we all can hear you. Now please welcome Professor Turnbull.
Thanks very much, Stefan. And welcome everyone. Thank you for coming here this evening. And also, firstly, Steve, can you hear me reasonably clearly? How's that? That's fine. Okay, good. Thanks also for the opportunity to get a chance to talk about science for once. I spend too much time doing sort of management things, and this is my opportunity to remind myself why I became an academic in the first place. So I think there are 2 things that drove the idea of tonight's talk. The first of them is several years ago, I think in 2008 or 2009, I quite foolishly agreed for a conference in North America to give a tutorial review of the way that the body was represented in the brain, which meant that I had to read a literature that I wasn't as familiar with as I would like to have been. And it allowed me to reframe my understanding based on really originally quite an old conception of the organization of the body within the skull. And it made me think about a few things, including the question of erogenous zones, which is really, why there are some parts of the body that seem especially preferentially interesting in romantic terms. In particular, some of them that are very unusual. Some people, especially women, actually report that the side of the neck, for example, is erotically interesting, and the earlobe, for example, is something that they like to have touched or nuzzled. There's some tissue that's right next door to it, for example, the front of the face, but no woman seems to report that they want their nose nuzzled or nibbled. It's a paradox. There's nothing very different about the skin in these 2 places, but there's a clear difference in the extent to which it's interesting. And rethinking the body reminded me of an idea suggested originally by Ramachandran in about 15 years ago now, about a possible neural basis for erogenous zones, which, although it was an interesting idea, and almost all of Rama's ideas are very interesting, it was remarkably empirically under-investigated. In fact, not investigated at all, I would say. So my plan this evening, as you'll see in a few minutes, is to try to walk you through a sort of tutorial review of what we know, or at least what I understand about what we know about the way that the body is organized within the brain. and to end that by discussing the question of erogenous zones and to give you a little bit of data that we've collected in the last little while, which I think speak to this question, and I think it's a scientifically interesting one, so that's my plan. Okay, I mean, if I can remind all of us here, I think I'm slightly famous, if anything, for an interest in Sigmund Freud, which is unusual, and especially Sigmund Freud as a neuroscientist. So I'll start with a bit of a Freud quote. The ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. We should remind ourselves that the body is the most important part of the entire universe for us. Certainly it is when you begin. We start out only as something that has an awareness primarily of our internal selves. And our feeling of self derived from exactly that process. But our understanding of the organization of the body within the brain is usually attributed, although it's not entirely accurate, this conception, to the work of Wilder Penfield. Beginning in the very late 1920s, he was famously a neurosurgeon in Montreal at the Montreal Neurological Institute and did a series of really quite groundbreaking experiments in which, in the open brains of patients who were about to undergo surgery for epilepsy, he engaged in direct stimulation of the cerebral cortex and was able to allow his patients, who were awake, of course, while their cranium had been opened, to get them to report what they were feeling. And on this basis, he reported, not for the first time, but certainly for the first time with this kind of accuracy, a description of primary somatosensory cortex, which lies in just back of the center of the cerebral cortex and has an upside-down representation of the body in the famous, if you know anything about neuropsychology and neuroscience, famous upside-down representation called the homunculus, which has a very large representation for the face and quite a substantial one for the hands and a foot on the medial surface. When people were touched in those areas by him in S1 or somatosensory cortex, they describe feeling sensation in those body parts. Here's another quote from Freud, just to show you, following on from this, what he said, that people very often quote the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego, but they seldom quote what Freud said beyond that. This is Freud, 1923, interestingly enough. The ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. If we wish to find an anatomical analogy for it, we can best identify it with the cortical homunculus of the anatomists, which stands on its head in the cortex, sticks up its heels, faces backwards, and as we know, has a speech area on the left-hand side. So Freud is quite clearly drawing an analogy with, if we were looking to see where in the brain the feeling of the body, the ego, might develop, he's linking this to S1, to primary somatosensory cortex. And in a later quote, he says, "There's nothing daringly new in these assumptions. We have merely adopted the view on localization held by cerebral anatomy, which locates the seat of consciousness in the cerebral cortex, the outermost enveloping layer of the cerebral organ." Now, as it turns out, I think this is probably one area in which Sigmund Freud happened to be wrong, but he was only wrong in the sense that everybody else was wrong at the same time, which is probably an excessive assumption that the outer layers of the cerebral cortex are the primary center for consciousness, but that's a complicated question that I don't especially want to get bogged in down now. Certainly, if you have a look in at least the popular literature and also in a number of introductory texts, one gets the assumption that I think Freud would have been happy to stick by almost a century ago, which is the idea that S1, primary somatosensory cortex, is the central map in the brain. It's the bit where the body is represented, that it represents all of the body, that it's consistent for all human beings, and finally that there's one section for each body region, which is more or less what I've described to you now. Okay, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time telling you that probably all four of those assumptions is incorrect, and I'm going to try to do that as systematically as I reasonably can, and I hope that Paul Downing, who's the largest world authority on the neural representation of the body that we have in the room at the moment, I think, will agree with me on at least some of those points. So here's my plan for today's talk, this sort of tutorial review. So firstly, I'm going to spend some time on what I've called exceptions, updates, and clarifications to discuss just exactly where is the body in the brain. I'll start with questions such as where are the viscera in primary somatosensory cortex? Is S1 the only map of the body? How malleable is this map? Those sorts of questions, which suggest that the ideas which we might traditionally have associated with the representation of the body are if not wrong, at least deserving of substantial modification. I'll then spend a bit of time, and I'm doing this in part so that I can begin to develop the neuroscience which underpins the erogenous zone arguments that I'm going to be giving you later. then I'm going to discuss very briefly again 2 disorders of body schema which bear on this question, which are, I think, in themselves opposites. And they are the question of whether there can be body parts that you still have, but you don't feel as if you have ownership of. And secondly, body parts which you don't have anymore, but which you do feel you have ownership of. And they are probably best described as hemispatial neglect in neuropsychology and phantom limb phenomena. They seem to describe, at least if you view it this way, as these paradoxical opposites. I'll spend a few minutes on that, at least in part again, because it demonstrates some of the neuroscience which Ramachandran suggested as the basis for his theory of erogenous zones. And finally, we'll discuss Rama's theory, and I'll show you some of the data which we've collected, which in some respects I think do confirm Rama's theory, but in other respects I think almost certainly don't. So that's the big plan. If everybody's comfortable with that, I will dive in. Yes? Okay, I want to start with the smaller side, which is about topographical relationships and the way in which maps are mapped onto the original parts of the world. So all sorts of maps are distorted in a number of different ways. They tend to exaggerate important elements in the things that might be quite small in the outside world, but actually are very important, and they tend to make them very big. And there are some elements of the outside world that aren't very important, and the maps tend to downplay these or even ignore them completely. And in order that idea doesn't sound too abstract, I offer you the tube map of the London Underground, which explains at least partly why I had the original image on the screen when we all arrived here this evening. This is a version of the map. It's quite famous. I think it's probably the world's most famous topographical map, and it describes the various parts of the London Underground in these straight lines, and in particular, you'll see that it has sort of straight lines in a number of places and quite a substantial representation of the complexity in the center of the map. It's all based, I don't know if there are any London Underground geeks in the room here, but in case you aren't, Harry Beck is the person who famously first devised this map in 1933, and you'll see that it shows all of the classical descriptions. It has a substantial area of representation for the central parts of the tube system, because it's really important that you see those quite clearly. After all, you're going to make your changes over there, whereas he spends much less time on the periphery, which are all stuck together in these straight lines. And if that doesn't seem especially innovative, I'll show you the map that preceded Harry Beck's map. And there it is. That's how different it looks. It is, of course, a much more accurate representation of reality in that it shows you all the tube line down over here. Look at those enormous gaps between all of those spaces, and it exactly shows you as the various component parts of the map curve around. But unfortunately, in representing reality with accuracy, it clogs up the very central part of the map, which is all the stuff you really care about, and does very little for describing things in the periphery. If you're stuck on a train moving from Putney Bridge to Southfields or whatever, you don't need to know whether it's on a curve or not. You just need to know when the next station is. So you can afford, if you have a look in Beck's map, to scrunch up those bits because it's unimportant information, whereas you need to spend much more time on the central part of the map. And that famously, of course, is what the primary somatosensory cortex does. It exaggerates parts of the body that are especially important, like, for example, the face, and especially the lower parts of the face, and indeed the hands, which are especially enlarged. That's the famous unusual representation of the somatosensory homunculus. So, on for my updates and clarifications. If this map is supposed to be the map of all of the body, I ask you, at least in the first instance, where on earth are the viscera? We might think that all of the parts of the body that are important for human beings are represented on the outside. After all, our feelings of self are by and large driven by striated musculature and the fact that we can move around these peripheral parts of our arms and legs and our face. But a really substantial part of our body lies in the internal part of ourselves. And it's more vital than the outside parts, because you can get rid of these outside parts and become a quadriplegic, for example, and still be alive, but you can't fiddle with the inside bits and still maintain life as we know it. So you might well ask yourself, if this is a map of the entire body, where are the viscera? And the viscera are very partially represented, if you were in that sort of a mood, in areas at the bottom part of somatosensory cortex, when at least you get to the larynx and pharynx, and in some of the newer data you'll see, if you go into the medial part of somatosensory cortex in the insula, there is a slight increase in representation of those areas, but they're not the core of the representation of this body, the part that keeps us all alive. Actually, one might reasonably say that primary somatosensory cortex maps the external part of the world. We don't perhaps see it as an external part of the world, but it's the part of our body that interacts with the external world. The internal part of the system is represented in a much more phylogenetically ancient part of the brain, primarily, for example, in the upper parts of the brainstem and the hypothalamus and a number of other structures which are also subcortical and are substantially connected to it. So, for example, as we all learnt in biological psychology lectures as undergraduates, the control of things like thermoregulation or blood sugar level or hunger or thirst are controlled by a range of subcortical nuclei, especially in the hypothalamus, and very, very far away and much poorly connected to areas like primary somatosensory cortex. For those of you who want to follow that literature up, there's an increasing understanding of the importance of these body parts. Antonio Damasio has been sort of ploughing a furrow for this together with my colleague Jörg Panksepp and demonstrating that a number of nuclei in the upper part of the brainstem and the hypothalamus seem pretty important for the feelings that we have of self. In many ways, also tied to the central feeling that we have of consciousness. Indeed, it's probably quite hard to disturb these core self-related parts of the mind without at the same time losing consciousness entirely. There's even a theory, although I won't spend very much time about it, speaking about it here tonight, which suggests that the reason that we have consciousness itself is in order to become aware of these rather primitive feelings. It's also associated with a range of basic emotion systems. Happiness, anger, sadness, and fear are the usual list, which extend not only in these upper brainstem areas like the periaqueductal gray, but also across a range of subcortical structures like the amygdala, for example, and the anterior cingulate gyrus. But I'm not here to talk very much about those brain areas, only to point out that if we want to think about the body, we need to think about all of the body, and by that I don't mean the external musculature, which seem very well represented in primary somatosensory cortex, but also there's a whole other part of the internal self that we all have, which doesn't seem to get very much representation in those body areas. Okay, clarification number 2. There is more than one version of the anatomy of the homunculus. Since the original maps that were drawn by Penfield, there have been a number of other variants. The most famous ones, and the ones that I'm showing most commonly over here, are these by Netter, who drew them in his very famous anatomical texts in the sort of second half of the last century. I do think for people who follow Mad Magazine, I know it's not very fashionable anymore, but it does remind me enormously of the Mad Magazine character. I see David's the only person in the room who read Mad Magazine, but you know where I'm coming from. What was his name again, David? Okay, there we go, Alfred Newman. So, but there are a number of differences in the way in which the body was represented in these maps over the years. There are a few interesting papers actually on the way in which these maps and their drawings have changed. I've got 2 versions over here. I hope you can see it reasonably clearly, and I'd like to point out a couple of interesting things. The first of them is there's an area claimed to be intra-abdominal on this version over here. Above it, I hope you can see it has the tongue and the pharynx, and the tongue and the pharynx are in the Newman version of the map, but the intra-abdominal area is not on that version, but it is in this version, and we'll see a little bit more about that later. I'd also like to point out, because of course it's going to be very important for us later, that the genitals appear in the medial part of this map, but the Netter version seems to have the genitals omitted, presumably for reasons of prudishness. But just be aware of it, that below the level of the feet is supposed to be in this map the representation of the genitalia. And the next fact which I'd like to keep in mind is that the head is represented in 2 entirely different parts of primary somatosensory cortex. Firstly, the anterior part of the head, the front end, the face, is represented in the lower parts, whereas the back of the head, that is particularly the sort of hairline and the back of the head and also the neck, is represented far, far away from that in the upper part of the body. But in this Netter version, there's no attempt to represent that distinction, but it turns out, of course, to be really quite important. Okay, so you need to be careful about which version of primary somatosensory cortex you're looking at when you look at any of these maps. Next, I'd like to keep in mind that there are several ways of looking at primary somatosensory cortex that aren't just in terms of whether the maps are accurate or not. For example, we receive from the periphery a number of different sources of tactile information, not only light, touch, and vibration information, pain, vestibular information, temperature, proprioception, joint position sense, all arrive in in different ways. And if you have a look in S1, it's in more primitive versions of the maps of S1 described as one solid chunk of tissue that runs all the way down from the top of the brain to the lateral sulcus over here. But for those of you familiar with Brodmann maps, you'll know that actually S1 is divided up into a number of important subsections, and these seem to represent the variants which derive from the peripheral musculature, each making a kind of a tiny version of the homunculus that runs parallel in S1. Are you disagreeing with that, Paul, or just agreeing? Yeah, that's fine. I'm not contesting it. I just, if I'm going off piece, you need to let me know. Okay. My next observation, I think also a very important observation, is that primary somatosensory cortex is not only the part that doesn't represent the viscera, but also it's not the only homunculus. So it's not all that easy to find what the full list of them are, but I've managed to find nice pictures of two of them. And the first of them is within the thalamus. As any good student of neuropsychology will know, the cortex is represented in is divided up into a number of different cortical areas, and the thalamus is similarly divided up, and there's a set of very direct connections between each of the thalamic nuclei and wide territories of the cerebral cortex. And if you have a look in, I think, the ventrolateral nucleus of the hypothalamus, you will see that there is indeed a homunculus, a representation of different parts of the body in different parts of that thalamic nucleus, although it lacks the over-exaggeration and over-representation of, for example, the hand and the face, which one sees in primary somatosensory cortex. And if you're in the mood, you can find another homunculus in the cerebellum. So there's an argument for even more than that. I won't try to make the list, and those are the only ones that I could find nice pictures for. Then I'd like to remind us all that somatosensory representation, one way or another, extends well beyond primary somatosensory cortex. I mentioned earlier that if you go down from S1 towards this area over here, the lateral sulcus, and open it up, you start to see in some of those maps that Netta showed us, areas that are sometimes described as intra-abdominal, but we now know much more about those areas, sometimes described as S2. These areas in the insula, especially the more anterior parts of the insula, seem to light up in a number of body-related tasks that are engaged in the imaging literature. It's quite a contentious finding, this, because after the leading authority in this topic area, who's Bud Craig, published these findings demonstrating from imaging work, he brought it together across a really diverse literature. He's been suggesting that the primary representation of the body and indeed the self might have something to do with the insula. His work has been contested by Damasio in a paper earlier this year, which demonstrates that you can bilaterally lose insular cortex, I think after herpes simplex encephalitis, and still have some very profound feelings about the self, and still be as aware of yourself as you and I might feel. And it rather bears on the question that I discussed earlier in relation to the representation of the viscera, and suggests really that the self is much more primitive than in brain terms than Bud Craig might suggest. But nevertheless, there's reasonable arguments that the insula and other areas perhaps nearby that lie on the inferior surface of the frontal lobe are involved in the representation of the viscera. It's also worth pointing out that areas of the body are arguably represented in parts of the parietal lobe over here that are behind primary somatosensory cortex, what in the old terminology one might call association cortex, or the superior and inferior parietal lobule, if you're wanting to look in anatomical terms. And I tried to make a list earlier of the various disruptions that one might reasonably get after this. I think disorders of tactile perception are pretty common, usually described in neuropsychology as the agnosias, and there are tactile agnosias. The relative location of body parts is disrupted in these patients, usually described as asomatognosia. The orientation of people in space is disrupted. The capacity to draw things or build things. Complex voluntary action is disrupted in these patients, usually described as the apraxias. Reading and writing, of course, which are just a form of complex voluntary action. Arithmetical ability, which have a huge spatial component to them. And indeed the question of body part ownership, which I'll be discussing a little bit later. So it's again a mistake, I think, to think of the body, even if you're just going to think about the cerebral cortex, as being somehow represented in S1. S1 seems to have the most direct connections to the periphery of the body, and allow us to feel things there. But if you're going to think about what our body feels like and what it feels like to be in our body, you would have to take into account not only these other homunculi that are living elsewhere in the brain, but also other areas of parietal cortex, which seem to be very important for the representation of the body in more complex ways, and indeed for awareness. There's also literature on the lateral asymmetry in this mental capacity, which links, I think, to David Carey's lecture in this series 2 weeks ago. There seems to be a rightward bias, for example, in the representation of emotion in these body areas. Hemispatial neglect and the questions of ownership, as we'll discuss later, are much more common after right than left-sided lesions, and the spatial impairments are also more common there too. Bud Craig, indeed, wants to make an argument about asymmetries in the way in which insula represents the body, and the usual claim of his is that energy expenditure parts of our emotional lives are more represented in the right-sided insular cortex, which have to do with the sort of powerful, energizing emotional feelings, whereas insular cortex associated with the left cerebral hemisphere has to do with sort of energy conservation elements of, and some of the happier aspects of our emotional lives, and indeed the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. But I don't want to spend too much time about that, but I think it's an important distinction. And finally, and I'm going to spend a bit more time on this one, the idea that we all have the same primary somatosensory cortex has come under substantial attack in the last couple of decades in a huge series of findings. The classic argument, of course, is that we all look like, the Netter diagram. We have the same design for primary somatosensory cortex, and I'll spend a little bit of time showing you how malleable this material might be. My simple layperson sketch on this topic is in this little cartoon here. So let's imagine we have a strip of somatosensory cortex that's divided up between areas A, B, and C. We can ask ourselves, what would happen if you didn't have sensory input to area B for one reason or another? Perhaps, for example, you were denied access to sensation. Maybe you lost a limb, for example, or your limb was tied up and immobile for a while. What would happen to the areas A and C which surround it? And the answer appears to be that it becomes occupied by nearby bits of cortex, so that area C sort of expands into this territory and area A expands into this territory, so that area B, which hasn't been sort of keeping up its end of the bargain, becomes reduced in its capacity. So then we can ask ourselves the question of what happens when you touch or somehow stimulate this area which used to be B. What sort of feeling would you get? And the answer is perhaps, as you'll see from some of these data, that you get a feeling which is still B-ness, because after all you're in territory that was occupied by area B, but simultaneously you can also have feelings of A-ness or C-ness, because it's now occupied by that area. So you'd have some sort of dual representation in somatosensory cortex of these body areas. So that's the cartoon, and I'll show you some of the data which might underpin it. There's a whole series of findings. I don't want to spend too much time on them. For example, in studies which require animals to use either very fine, delicate parts of activity in getting food from a well, or grabbing things out in sort of large handfuls, you can demonstrate really substantial changes in the way in which single-cell recording of somatosensory cortex is generated. There's a whole series of very interesting findings on people who use specialized capabilities. Opera singers are one category. I think there might be something on violinists. And they demonstrate, again, I don't want to spend too much time on these data, but substantial increases in the lower parts of primary somatosensory cortex, presumably because of the increased control of the larynx and the pharynx in these participants. The data aren't ideal and have been criticized, I think, over the years, but nevertheless, they are striking. I'd also like to point out what I think is really quite a remarkable finding, that it's possible not only to have areas of somatosensory cortex change, but even to take on representation for parts of the world that aren't your body. And the phenomenon is usually called tool embodiment. Here's the classic study, which demonstrates if you find a cell which fires when the hand of a macaque monkey is touched, then the question is what happens when the animal then uses a rake in order to have to go through the bars of their cage in order to rake in some external food, and after a couple of weeks of practice with this, you find the remarkable effect that if the animal has been dexterously raking food from far away from its body and learning the hard task of rolling something towards you by practicing, then you can get activation of hand cells by touching or even going near the tool, as if the tool has somehow become embodied and become a part of the animal. And in control conditions, in which the animal gets to touch the rake but doesn't have to do something dexterous and involve a sort of feeling of ownership about moving it around, you don't get a similar activation when the tool itself is touched. And it I think kind of runs akin to the way in which we think about ourselves. When you try to reverse park your car, for example, when you're used to that, I think the tail end of your car feels like it's a bit of the part of your body, and you sort of know where it is, even though you don't quite, it's not entirely part of you. And certainly when you scrape your car against the side wall, if you make a mistake, it does feel in a sense as if your body has become slightly injured. Okay, there's also a whole series of findings which suggest how fragile our bodily representation is. The rubber hand illusion and other illusions that are usually called body transfer illusions are especially interesting. I don't know if everyone in the room has heard of these findings. They get a lot of airtime on Discovery Channel and the like. But the classic finding involves putting a real hand, as you can see, in the same place or quite nearby a dummy, a model hand, and then you stroke simultaneously the real hand and the dummy. The important thing is that the person looks at the dummy hand and not at their real hand, and it seems that after time, and really when by say time I mean seconds or certainly small numbers of minutes, this begins, at least for some people, to feel as if it's their hand. It requires in fact, not even a very high level of definition, but so long as the tactile information is roughly synchronous. So you don't need some special computer that makes sure it's millisecond accurate. It's just more or less sort of accurately simultaneously touched. And so long as roughly your hand is in basically the same orientation and shape as the original, it doesn't have to look like an absolutely perfect model of your hand. It just has to look roughly similar. Then you can start to get firstly the sensation that it might be coming from the dummy. And for some people, the feeling that in some way this has become their hand. The classic version of this finding is to then take out a hammer and then smash something on top of the dummy's hand, and people feel as if their hand's just been attacked, including showing some very nice skin conductance findings, which suggest, by comparison with a control condition, that it felt like it was a bit of them. And it's a little, of course, like the tool embodiment example that I gave you earlier, something in the external world that somehow comes to be owned by us. The most striking findings are the transfer of the entire body, and the paper that I think got the most attention 2 years ago now had men looking in a sort of virtual reality setting. I think I have a bit of this situation on these sketches over here, having their body touched while they had, through virtual reality, the view of coming from somebody else's body. They got the most striking version of it by men appearing to peer out of a female body. But if you touch the body in the correct synchronous way, in synchronous places, you can get exactly those sorts of effects. I don't know, I haven't seen the original video, but it does appear in the end to involve, in the virtual version, the person who's been touching your body then slapping you across the face. And you get substantial SCR effects, which aren't there in the control condition and depend on how you're slapped, which suggest that it's, in a sense, you've felt that it's become your body, which is a pretty surprising thing. Okay, so, and I hope in general I've demonstrated to you that the feelings which we have about somatosensory cortex and the feelings of being in our body are remarkably unstable and malleable by comparison with what we might have believed. And certainly the classic idea about the way in which the body is represented in primary somatosensory cortex has become either redundant or much more sophisticated in the last couple of decades, which I suppose is consistent with the complexity which we feel in relation to our bodies. So I'll briefly discuss two disorders that I discussed earlier, which are about owning something that you don't have anymore and not wanting to own something or not feeling you own something which you don't have. Given that this audience is made up of a surprisingly high fraction of people from the School of Psychology, I don't know if, would you put your hand up if you're not from the School of Psychology in this room? Ah, okay. I hope I've got the pace roughly correct here. Are you from, so I'm going at the right speed for you, am I? Can I ask whereabouts you are from? Wow, and you were attracted by The body or the erogenous zones? Wow, well, we have got this is what WICN public lectures are all about, I suppose. Well, I'm delighted to welcome. Okay, so if I've got the speed roughly correct, I'll just try to run through at reasonably the same pace, the material in relation to these two neuropsychological findings. Classic findings, really, they've been around for decades. Hemispatial neglect is the first one, which is, as every undergraduate neuropsychologist knows, and as people from environmental sciences will know in a few seconds, a disorder in which people typically after lesions to the right side of the right cerebral hemisphere, especially by and large the right parietal, inferior parietal lobe, although the data is slightly contested these days, they neglect or ignore the left side of space. So they don't seem to be aware of it in a number of different ways. They don't, for example, draw pictures or copy the left-hand side of objects in any substantial detail. They don't dress the left-hand sides of their body. They don't eat food on the left-hand side of their plate. They seem only to be able to turn right rather than left when they're trying to navigate around the world, at least in the classic version of these phenomena. Here is Bob Rafal, I think he's in the room. So that picture of the famous Bob Rafal, looking just as young there as he is now. Bob, is that accurate? Engaging with the patients with neglect. These patients tend to be paralyzed on the left side of their body, and although none of us try to ignore Bob these days, this patient does seem to be ignoring Bob on the left-hand side. Okay, the lesion site's a little more contentious. Here are some findings from Hans-Otto Carneth a couple of years ago. That certainly the idea that the right cerebral hemisphere is very important seems central to all of this. It is of some interest, I think, especially that the lesion sites in patients who deny that they have a deficit seems especially located in an area that might be described as the insula. And Bud Craig, of course, is one of those, as the world's greatest insular fan, is making much of the fact that the insula seems to be very important for these the lesion site in these patients. And I think it's that in itself is intrinsically interesting. Here are those findings again. So here's a description, this time from a patient of Oliver Sacks, called The Man Who Fell Out of Bed. It's about a patient who he saw first when he was an intern and just had a stroke and had been admitted to hospital. And here's the description of the case. When he woke up, he felt fine until he moved in bed. And then he found someone's leg in the bed, a severed human leg, a horrible thing. It seemed perfectly formed, but peculiar and cold. The patient thought, surely it was a joke. So he picked it up and threw the damn thing out of bed. And at this point, his conversational manner deserted him, and he suddenly trembled and became ashen pale. When he threw it out of bed, he somehow came after it, and now it was attached to him. Have you ever seen such a creepy, horrible thing? I thought a cadaver was just dead, but this is ghastly, and it seems stuck to me. He seized it with both hands and with extraordinary violence, and tried to tear it off his body, and failing, punched it in an excess of rage. I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like nothing on earth. How can a thing like that belong to me? So then Sacks asked the inevitable question. One final question. If this thing, if it's not your left leg, then where is your own left leg? Once more he became pale, so pale that I thought he was going to faint. I don't know, he said. I have no idea. It's disappeared. It's gone. It's nowhere to be found. So these patients, I mean, firstly, you would think, you can't find your own left leg. There's something which is attached to you, and it's a left leg. What's the best conclusion to draw from this material? But they don't seem to be able to draw that conclusion. It's a very extreme case, and this sort of hatred of the left-hand side, misoplegia, it's usually described as, is pretty rare. But nevertheless, Sacks's case is a very interesting example. It also shows how once we lose ownership of our beloved body, it somehow becomes less interesting and even a bit sort of nasty. There's something about our own ego involvement and our own narcissism that makes the body parts we own, hopefully, look good for us. And in some cases, which are the sort of opposite of this, usually called body dysmorphia, they can look especially toxic. But in most cases, we really quite like our own bodies. And when we lose that sense of ownership, they seem much more difficult. So these are cases in which a body part is still attached to you. It's still part of your body, but you don't feel a sense of ownership. The inverse scenario is arguably the phantom limb case, which Riddoch, the neurologist, I don't know, for those of you who know Jane Riddoch, the neuropsychologist who was in Birmingham and is now in Cambridge. I think Bob would be able to answer this. I think it's her uncle who was the neurologist. It was her grandfather. So he didn't claim, by the way, that phantom limb was direct proof of the existence of the soul, but he does cite Nelson in this regard. So Nelson, of course, famously lost a limb and regarded as a good religious individual. The fact that he still felt that the limb was there, even though the limb wasn't there, as the existence of the soul, because of course, your soul has your entire body, and if the world wants to chop off a bit of your body, you will still retain that feeling of yourself despite that. It's not perhaps the very best evidence for the existence of the soul, but you can take your data where you'd like to if you want to demonstrate that. I particularly like, by the way, the work of Alexa Wright. She's an artist who's worked with the Wellcome Trust for a number of years and who portrays images of herself but with various people's disabilities, or makes images of those people in relation to their disabilities. There are a number of, this is Alexa, as a number of well, in some cases neurological disorders, but she has over the years described some people who have phantom limb. She takes a photograph of them and then using, I presume, Adobe Photoshop or something like that, then draws the nature of their phantom on their portrait, so you can get to see what their phantom looks like. And I think we all know what phantom limb is usually described as by these patients. It's a feeling that the limb is still there, although often, after it's been amputated, but often it's changed quite dramatically in its shape. This next image, which is particularly challenging, the hand itself has got much larger, but it's attached by a little stalk to the rest of her arm, and she still has a wedding ring on her phantom finger, which then bites into her finger and makes her feel especially painful. So these are patients who, in the opposite way round to neglect, have lost a part of their body, but still feel ownership of those body parts. And an idea suggested by the ever creative Villeneuve Ramachandran and tested out by him in the 1990s suggested a possible account for this. And in order to get to the erogenous zones, we're going to pass through this bit of the body. So Ramachandran's finding with patients who have phantom limb involve touching parts of their body that are near in primary somatosensory cortex, the body part which they've lost. So this arm over here and hand, which is just above the face, Ramachandran discovers clinically that there appears to be sensation in the phantom limb following touching the face. So here he goes. I placed the blindfold over his eyes because I didn't want to see him, or didn't want him to see where I was touching him. Then I took an ordinary Q-tip, that is an earbud or whatever, on this side of the pond, and started stroking various parts of his body surface, asking him to tell me where he felt the sensations. My graduate student who was watching thought that I was crazy. I swabbed his cheek. What do you feel? You're touching my cheek. Anything else? Hey, it's funny, said Tom. You're touching my missing thumb, my phantom thumb. I moved the Q-tip to his upper lip. How about here? Now you're touching my index finger and my upper lip. So, the index finger and the upper lip simultaneously in a way that harks back to something I said about 15 minutes ago, which is about the occupation of the middle parts of a brain area when there's no longer activation from the bit of the body that represents that. Really, are you sure? Yes, I can feel it in both places. How about here? I stroked the lower jaw with a swab. That's my missing pinky. Okay, so Rama then follows up in the very earlier days of functional imaging with some representation for the touching of different body parts after this patient who's been amputated. And as you can see, in the right cerebral hemisphere over here, you can see in black the areas for the representation of the face, which are low down, and then the hand and the arm, which are hatched, and the leg, which are white. Okay, it looks like it's not perfect, but nevertheless, it's in the right sequence for somatosensory cortex. And over here, what you can see is that the face and the arm appear to have dissolved, of course, in the middle. You can't touch someone's real arm, but the other two body parts seem to have moved a little bit closer together. Now, they're slightly contentious findings, but they do suggest the very interesting proposition that was with us 10 or 20 minutes ago, that what you have when you no longer have sensation from the outside world is the occupation of this intermediate territory by the two surrounding parts of somatosensory cortex. And here's a more similar finding during a more recent finding, during a lip pursing task. So it involves moving a bit of the face, and you'll see that there's activation in phantom limb patients, not only of the face itself, but also of some areas further up in somatosensory cortex, suggesting that there's, again, an occupation of parts of somatosensory cortex that are not found. And that effect is not found in people who are also amputees, but they don't have phantom limb pain. And the suggestion, because every now and again this sort of sensation arrives in these patients, is that, for example, they might touch their cheek or a bit of wind would blow their cheek, and now suddenly that will activate the phantom at the same time as involving the activation of the parts of the somatosensory cortex that map onto the face. So that's the sort of background to the argument. And now for the erogenous zones, which I would like to thank Victoria Lovett and my two collaborators in South Africa who helped to collect the data. I'm not suggesting that this looks like either of those collaborators or that they were responsible for doing it. It just happens to be the most interesting picture of the erogenous zones that I had. Okay, so there are two ways in which people use the word erogenous. One of the members of the audience asked me earlier what the erogenous zones really were. I won't embarrass you by pointing out who you were sitting next to at the time. You are engaged, is that correct? It's, yeah, I couldn't resist it. Okay. So some people describe erogenous zones as areas which are erotic, and in that case the genitals kind of win hands down. And they're clearly very erogenous, although as you'll see later on there are some other body parts as well. But I'm particularly interested in the idea of erogenous zones, not in relation to the genitals, which have a very direct connection to brain areas that are reward-related, but in other body parts that are apparently, on the face of it, neutral, because they're not the genitals, but nevertheless seem to produce erotic sensation when they are touched. And I'm thinking of areas like the neck or the earlobe, for example, or indeed the inner thigh. Can I say, by the way, that for something that you would think is very interesting, this is remarkably under-investigated. So we managed to find a book by a woman who, first of all, it was clear that every second issue of Cosmopolitan seemed to have an article on erogenous zones. We even found a book by a woman who wrote for Cosmopolitan saying, if there's nothing we do every year, it's that we bring out a lot of articles on erogenous zones because people really like to read those. But we found remarkably little data in the proper scientific investigation of sex on this topic area. My favorite and most horrific example is the Kinsey report. Kinsey asked, I think it's just over, in theory you can ask just over 530 questions on his questionnaire. I think on average people only answered about 300 of the 500 or so. Questions like, which members of your family have you had carnal relations with? And which other animal species have you had carnal relations with? I mean, really, questions that are kind of on the boundaries of what you might conceivably want to ask. But did Kinsey, in his 500 questions, try to work his way through the body and ask, do you like to be touched in area A, B, C, and D? The answer is no. A similar argument applies to Masters and Johnson when they do the same topic. When the height report comes out, no one seems troubled to try to systematically measure the nature of erogenous sensation, even though Cosmopolitan and presumably a lot of other glossy magazines seem terribly interested in it. So there's a giant paradox here between the quality of the scientific literature and the level of interest of the public. And we were seeking, I think, to try to turn that around. I hope I don't have to mention to you what the stereotypes are about erogenous zones, but let me say that the typical argument is that they're more distributed, if that's the right way of describing it, in women than they are in men. This picture over here, I think, tries to capture that stereotype, and I'll have some answers about that stereotype for you in a couple of minutes. There's a Friends episode on this topic. I don't know if anyone is familiar with it. It says, they never describe what they are, but they say that there are 7, I think, erogenous zones, and the correct way of dealing with this is to go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, and so on. It's quite funny, actually. It only lasts 2 minutes. You can find it on the web just by typing Friends and erogenous zones or something like that, I suppose. It's a very interesting episode. Okay. In the meantime, there's really been quite a substantial literature in the representation of at least the genitalia in this literature, not the non-genital parts of erogenous representation, but certainly the genitalia. And they demonstrate, firstly, that the argument that the genitals are below the feet in primary somatosensory cortex seems less clear. There's certainly quite an argument for a representation, not in the lower parts of S1, but actually all the way towards the top end, the sort of the area in which the dorsal surface and the medial surface of the parietal cortex meet. There's quite a lot of individual variation as well, and there certainly is activation also of these medial parts. There also, by the way, seems to be substantial interaction between these body areas, and a real question about whether stimulation of the nipple, for example, leads automatically to activation of the genitals. But that's a bit of a technical question, but probably has some bearing on what we're going to talk about. So, Vilnius Ramachandran comes up with an idea in the mid to late 1990s about the nature of erogenous zones. He is particularly taken by the findings that he's just demonstrated in patients who have phantom limb, which shows how malleable and potentially also how fuzzy the representation of the boundaries are of S1. So if you can change these so easily just by having no sensation from the limb, it may well be, he argues, that there is a fuzziness in these parts of the body in S1 anyway, so that touching an area which is near the genitals in S1 terms will in itself activate the genitals, and that thereby makes the areas near S1, near the genitals in S1, which may be quite far in the body, actually quite erogenous. And when he mentions this, he's especially taken with the question of the feet, because we know that he thinks that the representation of the feet in primary somatosensory cortex is right next door to the genitals. And this, he argues, is why people like having their feet massaged. I'm not especially sure about that, and I'll show you some data on this topic, although there is an episode at the beginning of Pulp Fiction. I don't know if you remember that bit in Pulp Fiction, which clearly alludes to the fact that this is not only an interesting thing to do, but also a very dangerous thing to do, if you remember the way in which that story runs. Okay. So, I also remind you of the dual representation for the face that I discussed earlier, which is that the front part of the face, that is all of the anterior section that has the nose and the mouth and so on, all the way up to the forehead, is represented in the lower parts of somatosensory cortex, but the head, the back part of the face and the side of the neck is represented higher up, and indeed they are right next to the representation for the upper trunk. So Ramachandran argues the reason that the feet are erotic is because they're next door to the genitals, and the reason that the side of the neck is erotic is because it's next door to the representation for the nipple in the middle of the chest. That's at least the basis for Ramachandran's argument. And he presents two pieces of information which support this claim, although I would never say this in print, and I don't know how many nods I'll get from this audience, but Ramachandran is very good at generating ideas, but he's often a little more vague in the extent to which he generates the evidence to support those claims. Is that a smile, Paul? Okay. So he particularly cites, I think interestingly, by the way, the work of Salvatore Agliotti, who described the phantom breast phenomenon after radical mastectomy, which was reported in the early 1990s. Agliotti reports that women who have unilateral radical mastectomy, what happens, they develop in about a third of cases, I think, phantom breasts, and what happens if their earlobes are touched is that they feel sensation in their phantom nipple. Actually, Ramachandran reports that they feel erotic sensation in their phantom nipple, and after a lot of toing and froing for reasons that you'll see about the data we collected earlier, we then went back to the original Agliotti paper, and Agliotti says they feel sensation in their phantom nipples. It's kind of wishful way Ramachandran's introduced the word erotic into his into the Agliotti quote, which is an interesting Rama sort of thing to do. He also reports a case of his own, which I find remarkable, but I'll read it out anyway because it's in his book. Doctor, every time I have sexual intercourse, I experience sensations in my phantom foot. How do you explain that? My doctor says it doesn't make sense. Look, I said, one possibility is that the genitals are right next to the foot in the body's brain maps. Don't worry about it. He laughed nervously. All that's fine, doctor, but you still don't understand. You see, I actually experienced my orgasm in my foot, and therefore it's much bigger than it used to be because it's no longer just confined to my genitals. I always hesitate slightly before discussing this in a public audience because it does suggest that people seeking to enhance their sexual experience might well seek amputation. I'm really not recommending as a way of enhancing things. It's not the way forward. And I'm also not entirely sure. Rama describes this in a book. He's not written it up anywhere else, and I won't say any more than that. Okay. Right. So, as I said earlier, we were interested in collecting some data, arguably for the first time ever, which tried systematically to establish what the distribution of erogenous zones might be. And in order to do this, we surveyed people in Britain, in fact, students in Bangor University more than any other place in Britain, as students in a university in South Africa, in order to try to gather some data about what the basic demographics of these things might be, what are the effects of gender and nationality and sexual orientation and ethnicity, all those sorts of things, to see whether these things are hardwired. Our assumption was that if these are kind of written into the original design of the nervous system, then there should be reasonable reliability across all of these demographic variables. I think there are two ways in which they might not be if it's not hardwired. The first argument is there might be some cultural differences. That is, people in some countries might think that this bit of the body is a really erogenous bit, whereas that one isn't, and you might expect some cross-cultural effects. The second are effects of individual differences. So when you have your initial erotic encounters, if learning is very important for the erogenous zones, then you might imagine that when person A and B are together, they particularly focus on this part of the body, whereas when person C and D are together, they focus on that part of the body because of whichever way they're arranged on the couch when they have their first sexual encounter. That would suggest that there'd be a lot of individual variability. On the other hand, if things are hardwired, then people would work their way around different bits of the body on the couch, and eventually you'd say no, 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 yes, and then you'd all reach the same conclusion. That's the idea. We also so that's why we wanted to gather the demographic data, and we also tried to see whether if there was at least some level of statistical agreement across really what turns out to be a reasonably large sample about whether these brain areas might co-activate, whether people reported that if area A was reported as high, whether other areas seemed also rated high, presumably because they were nearby in primary somatosensory cortex. That would be Rama's argument. So these are the data. About 800 participants, slightly more females than males, presumably because there's a lot of psychology students in there. We put it on the web internationally. About half of the participants are from sub-Saharan Africa, mostly South Africa and Johannesburg, and about a third from Britain. And the other sort of 13% are distributed across the world. And I'm going to show you a couple of graphs now, just for data clarification reasons. We've excluded the minor parts of a population whenever I show you the correlations. So, for example, if I'm going to compare the British Isles to Africa, then I'm leaving the 13% of people out who are from other countries because it would just complicate things. And when I talk about, well, you'll see what the other demographic groups look like. We've tried it, including the other groups and lumping them in different places. You don't get any substantial differences because the graphs are remarkable, in my humble opinion. I've been a psychologist for several decades now, and I'm used to finding the old modest correlation values that you get of 0.2 and 0.3 and 0.4, and that was not the result that we got here. Okay, so we collected the survey about 41 body parts, all of which are the same with the exception of 3 of them, which we were required to sort of lump together for ease of analysis in generating some of the correlation data that I'll show you now. We made the assumption that we would score clitoris and penis and scrotum and vagina and chest and breast together. We tried it without those things and you get basically the same data, but for tidiness sake, we wanted to include all of the body parts. These are the first 2 sets of data, and the correlation values are genuinely remarkable. Basically, they're about 0.9 or better for different body parts. First, this is by nationality. This is the British Isles versus sub-Saharan Africa, and the correlation values are is that 0.98? Basically, wherever you are across these 2 continents, people show remarkable consistency. I'll show you some examples of inconsistency in a little while, but truly remarkable degrees of agreement between the 2 samples. the effect is a little bit more modest, but also very, very powerful in terms of ethnic origin. Comparing black with white people of mixed race, we excluded a small number of them from the sample, but it makes no difference which of the other categories you want to put them in. Here are the effects of age for people who are worried about the way these things apply across the generation. Now, our median was at 25, so we compared the under versus the over 25s, and you get basically exactly the same effect, and you get exactly the same effect for the effects of sexual orientation. Huge, very high degrees of correlation. The only one that wasn't quite so high, but still pretty impressive, are the effects of sex differences when you compare males with females. And the short answer is that at the sort of top end of the range. So the dotted line, by the way, is is the perfect correlation between two things. As you can see on the previous diagrams, the dotted lines follow pretty closely to the actual correlation lines. It differs a little in this direction and is skewed slightly female-wards. The agreement for the major items in the world of erogenicity are more or less the same, and there's a lot of agreement at the bottom end of the range. But in this kind of category over here, there's a bias towards women. But the R-squared, the R value is 0.89, so it still is remarkable. I'll just go through each one of them. So here are the data for the side of the neck, which are about 33% higher for women. The back of the neck scores about 37% higher. The nipples score about 50% higher, and breast versus chest, which is the highest, is much higher in women than in men. There's only one item that's higher in men than women, which is the perineum, and we had a little footnote, by the way, in case you were wondering, in case people didn't understand what that body part was. Okay, when you look at these data in a sort of, what's the right word, league table, if that's the right way of describing it, to try to compare men with women, you'll see I've tried to color code them here so that things that are scored over 9 are more than 8 are scored in red. And there's lots of material for both, but women are slightly ahead of the game. For things scored more than 7, again, there's material in both, but women are slightly ahead of the game, and so on all the way down. So, I can talk about the data a little bit later, but the bottom line, I think, if I can just return to this graph over here, are that basically there's substantial correlation between men and women in these categories, but the stereotype that I showed earlier in that little cartoon is at least partially justified. So there is a greater distribution of erogenous zones in women than in men, and it seems that the stereotype is just an enormous exaggeration of a modest trend that exists in the normal population. Okay, we did a few other analyses. We did a factor analysis of all of these material and got 3 principal components, no matter whether we did it on women or men. They're basically agreed. So the body parts cluster together in 3 major groups. The first of them are categorized as extremities, basically the 4 limbs. The head and the trunk tend to cluster together, and then the highly rated erogenous zones, the genitals and the nipples, for example, also tend to cluster together. And critically for Ramachandran, or one many bit of critically, is that the feet are classified with the other extremities in category 1. They're not there with the genitals and highly rated erogenous zones, even though he claims that they are next door to each other. We also did some multiple regressions. I'll spend a little bit less time on this, but they suggest that although some areas that are nearby in primary somatosensory cortex do tend to predict each other, it's also true that some areas that are very far apart in primary somatosensory cortex also tend to predict, are also correlated with each other. So I wouldn't say that these data tend to support Ramachandran very strongly either. Okay. So I have real problems with Rama's theory, and I particularly have problems with Rama's feet theory. When I was generating this talk earlier, I realized because of his interest in feet, I should put some pictures up. And I had a difficult moment in realizing while I was on the university computer just exactly what could I Google. I discovered this afternoon a site called Celebrity Feet. And I don't know if there are any people in the room who would like to guess which celebrities are associated with each of these feet, but there we go. The bottom line is that the scores for feet as erogenous zones are remarkably low. They tend to be about 1 to 2 across all those demographic groups on a scale of 1 to 10. and the other lower limb body parts are also scored even lower, like the toes and the ankle, for example. So although Ramachandran, at least in theory, should be producing a very powerful effect here, just in simple basic terms, people do not seem to find, as a question of having those body parts touched, them to be especially erogenous. And it led me to thinking, when I saw these data, that Rama's probably made a category error. And what he has, the category error I suspect he's made, is to mistake somatic sensation, that is, how much do I enjoy having my feet touched, or we enjoy in this room having our feet touched, because we don't clearly like having our feet touched especially much, is the short answer, with the external relation of the body part. That is the foot as a fetish object. And that's a very different question from the question of primary somatosensory cortex, but it turns out that the feet are great fetish objects. We then went to the fetish literature, and there are some papers on this. I don't mean the one on the internet, I mean there are some genuine papers. And it turns out, if you lump them together, that if you look at feet and associated lower limb items, which include, ankles and shoes and stockings, they constitute about half of all body part fetishes are really about the lower limbs. If you want to go to that paper, there are some really strange fetishes that people have, but there are minority interests. And in fact, I suspect, you remember why I said to you earlier that, are our erogenous zones generated kind of in utero by the design of the brain, and the time you spend on the couch is going, no, 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 yes, I suspect that's probably true for the erogenous zones, but I suspect that it's not true for fetishes. I think the things that you're interested in the outside world are probably based on what you happen to run into first. And why the feet should be erogenous or not is a discussion we can have at another time. But it seems that these are probably derived more based on life experience than they are based on something that's hardwired. And I think Ramachandran has probably made a bit of a mistake here. Whether that suggests that Ramachandran himself is more interested in feet than your average person, I could draw my own conclusions. But I do think it is genuinely a category error. Or how else do you explain the remarkable fact that behaviorally our participants don't seem to think that those body parts are very interesting. But on the other hand, there's a really remarkable literature suggesting that the feet are especially interesting, as the site Celebrity Feet suggests. Okay. There's also one other category of literature that I hadn't thought about beforehand, and then the more I thought about it, the more I thought this is an interesting way of testing it, which is, Wilder Penfield from an hour ago at the beginning of this talk was interested in stimulating parts of the cortex. Well, if S1 really is the source of erogenous sensation, then when Wilder Penfield gets to the erotic parts, even the genital parts of S1, and he stimulates them, it's going to feel fantastic. Now, that doesn't really argue consistently with what I said at the beginning of this talk, which is that I suspect that the elements which underpin basic emotions, including feelings of arousal, are probably phylogenetically very old and are based subcortically, perhaps even in areas as ancient as the upper brainstem. But nevertheless, it's testable. And Penfield reported exactly that. Patients who had seizures, for example, that started in primary somatosensory cortex, and many instances in which Wilder Penfield stimulated somatosensory cortex itself. Here's a patient with a seizure, and the sensation, presumably because the tumor, I think it is, lies directly between these two areas. She has sensation in both the labia and the nipple, and Wilder Penfield, like a good scientist, interrogates her at some length and says there was nothing in the sensation that resembled sexual excitement. Now, I know it's a bit of a clinical situation, so maybe she wasn't going to say very much, but you would think that she might report it. Penfield, after his series of 400 patients in his cortical stimulation studies, admittedly not all of them stimulated in the genitals, says, curiously enough, we have never produced erotic sensations of any sort by electrical stimulation. Okay, so which conclusions might one draw based on the findings that I've tried to put out to you earlier? Well, I think, on the one hand, there genuinely is enormous demographic consistency about the findings that we've got. I really do think that the erogenous zones are pretty reliable internationally across genders, sexual orientations. Really, it's that when you see correlations like that, you have to think hardwired, or at least they tend to make me think hardwired. So in that sense, you would think that Ramachandran's got to be right. But on the other hand, the cortical version of his theory doesn't seem to have very much support. In particular, the feet thing just isn't working for anybody. The stimulation studies aren't working appropriately. So, how could we conceivably reconcile this? And it makes me wonder, although I don't have an answer to it, whether the answer is that there is a map somewhere in the brain which reports the various parts of the body, and in which perhaps the areas which represent the genitals are right next door to some other parts of the body, and that's the reason why we get the reports that Ramachandran describes earlier. That is the argument about proximity in bodily representation, in the representation of the brain, may be the cause of the distribution of erogenous zones. I just don't think it's S1. And there are lots of other maps out there, including lots of other maps that are more direct, that are more ancient and subcortical than primary somatosensory cortex. So although I don't have an answer to this question, it does make me rethink, and it had made me rethink that entire literature. So in summary then, I think primary somatosensory cortex is much more interesting than I thought it was going to be when I was asked a couple of years ago to give a tutorial review of the topic. And I hope I've given you a sort of a reasonable survey of what is quite a complex literature. There's a lot of anatomy out there, and the representation of the body is clearly much more complicated than the classic example that I described earlier, especially in relation to Freud's original description. I quite like this Berlucchi-Agliotti quote from a couple of years ago, in which he says, "The body in the brain is extremely unlikely to be isomorphic with the body itself, as implied by the body schema and body image concepts. Body-related brain areas argue for the existence of many bodies in the brain, and it does indeed suggest that we have, although we have a sensation of just having one body, probably it's derived from, multiple, 5 or 10 different aspects of bodily maps that are distributed across various parts of cortex and indeed subcortical areas, in the same way that in, for example, the memory literature, it's clear that we don't just have one system for memory, but that we're running 4 or 5 or 6 different sorts of memory systems that run in parallel. We have the feeling of having one kind of memory, and we have the feeling of having one kind of body, but actually we may have more than that. So I think it's a hugely, well, I've called it a brave new world over here. I think we all agree that, for example, erogenous zones are very interesting, but you can see how hugely under-investigated this area is. The body is clearly, as I said at the beginning of the talk, the most important thing that we know about the universe, at least wearing our hat of narcissism. So I think we need clearly, I think probably every scientist always ends their talk by saying we need more research, but I will, as tradition beholds, I'll finish, but by the way, clearly we need to investigate this in much more detail. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I will finish. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. And I'll take questions.
Thanks, Oliver. That was great. So talking about your online survey research, so you've asked people direct question, for each of these 41 body parts. And we know in psychology that asking someone a direct question isn't always the right way to get to the answer. You want to find implicit measures of behavior sometimes. So don't you need observational research?
Thanks for that. How did you imagine that we might collect it?
Well, I think
yeah.
You said you need further research.
Yeah. There is one version of that, actually. We thought that at very least that asking people retrospectively to remember how they'd done things was probably not quite so good. And we did try with some participants after we collected these data to say, will you sit down with somebody else and touch all 41 and then rate them at the time? Vicky got a telephone call from her friend at about 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning saying, thank you very much for signing me up to that experiment. That was the greatest Sunday morning my boyfriend and I have had in a long time. So there's probably something in working your way through all 41, and filling in a questionnaire is probably not a bad way to work on these things. I mean, I agree with you. Of course, observational data would be better. It's not one of those, unfortunately, where you can go to looking at people in erotic films or whatever, or cinema, probably because people would argue that there are cultural biases about where people should be, or maybe some bits that are easier to see by the Steven Spielberg behind the camera. So it would be tricky, I think. But in principle, I agree with you. The only counter-argument I have is the data are worryingly consistent. If you thought it's just, people are just not good at remembering these things, you would expect more noise, but that's not noise. That's people who all across the world. I mean, I remember when Vicky first started coding the data, there would be moments in which she would add up all the numbers for, South Africans on this thing and find out, elbow 4.3. And then she would do the numbers for the British participants, and the answer would be 4.3. And she would say, but maybe I've been sticking the numbers incorrectly into the calculator here. No, that's clearly a mistake. And she would go back and it would be 4.3 for both groups. How do you choreograph, 800 participants across all those demographic variables to produce that kind of a graph? It's suspiciously reliable to me. But I agree with you, of course, if you can just... Yeah, no, of course it would be great, but how do you do the experiment, Paul? That's the question. David?
I realized I was about to ask you a question about self-stimulation, but perhaps that would be poorly received. Brain stimulation,
of course. The people from the environmental sciences department just don't know what's going on here.
That's right. Well,
self-stimulation is when you have an electrode that goes into your brain and you push a lever and that stimulates the part of your brain.
So I'm trying to think of that old literature, which is Olds and Milner and other people like that, who showed it in the median four-brain bundle, and now people do all kinds of work on dopaminergic pathways and so on. But I think there have been some of these implants done for patients with chronic pain, etc. Any reports in that literature that sound interesting from an erogenous zones point of view?
I don't know well, I mean, obviously you need humans rather than, I mean, the rat studies, as you know, those Olds and Milner things from 50 years ago now, they're all subcortical. They're accumbens and bits of the hypothalamus and septal nucleus, and really they're old structures. I don't know whether the rats were getting aroused in doing that. I suppose you'd be able to tell. And I don't know of anyone describing erogenous sensation there. I mean, I know people like Helen Maybuck who've been doing those stimulation work, who get relief from depression and so on. I don't know if they've ever produced erogenous sensation either, but it's the sort of thing you would think, there's lots of people doing subcortical stimulation for Parkinson's, and they, every now and again, get it wrong. They overshoot with those electrodes. There's no reports of...
Say, no, leave it there.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know, but I think it's a very interesting question to be asking. And I think more generally, if you look at those electrical brain, everyone agrees that sex should be a stimulating, rewarding, or self-stimulation in the technical sense of the word for the environmental sciences people, body part. If S1 was like that, then David Olds, is it David Olds? James Olds, in the papers in the 50s, would have found cortical areas that were self-stimulation areas, and not a one. It's all the good ones are subcortical. So I think it's a very interesting question, David. Thank you. Yes.
The theories about the erogenous zones that you're talking about, based on these maps, they suggest that erogenous zones, other than the genitals, are basically a mistake. If there's some cross-wiring or something.
Mistake is a very bad word to use to describe something that's brought so much pleasure to humanity.
So I'm wondering, do you have an alternative to this idea that these erogenous zones are just an error, some
I don't know. And I don't know the literature about skin well enough. There are all sorts of arguments about different skin types, glabrous and non-glabrous skin, and the way in which the receptors seem to be mapped. I don't think they're especially mapped onto other parts of the skin. I know there's an argument about parts of the glans penis, for example, in relation to different skin types. But I don't, it's not like the skin on the side of your neck, as I said at the beginning, is different from the skin on your cheek. They're right next door. They have roughly the same density of nerve fibers. They've got the same density of hair. It's hard to tell a difference, and yet people say, no thanks, yes please. So finding a low-level sensation account of it seems unlikely, but I wouldn't rule it out. And it's the only other one that I can think of. I don't think the learned cultural thing is taking us anywhere in the context of those of the data that I showed you. But if you've got another idea, I'm open to suggestions, Rob. What did you think?
Could there be a reason for that?
I really don't. I've got no way of accounting easily for the for that one. Except, I mean, there are some, neurochemical differences. Serotonin levels are different or certainly sensitivity to serotonin levels are different in women to men, which explains, as you know, in part the differential depression literature. So it might be that you have the same sort of anatomy that accounts for the distribution of erogenous zones, and then some variant of neurochemistry that talks about priming those systems that might make them the small sex difference, the thing that it is. But really, it's not. It's an interesting speculation. I think Paul next, but you've already had a question, so maybe you should.
And this is just a question of how you actually went about wording the questionnaire. I'm just not clear on what the question was and how you went about fashioning the question to distinguish the affiliative touch in general, pleasurable affiliative touch, as a separate from a specific form of it, which is sexually arousing.
Sure.
And whether it's in some of the sex differences may have been the fact that women endorse other forms of affiliative touch as being more sexual than men. What was the actual question that was there?
Well, firstly, I think it would be very interesting, Bob, to ask affiliative touch separately from the erotic one. It was a question about, about how erotic those body areas are, and in fact, for people, because it was going out to the public, it was badged on one page as a hotness scale. How erotically charged, how aroused does touching this body area make you feel? So it was very clearly badged as sexual touch rather than affiliative. That might cause the sex difference. I agree. I think it would also have been interesting to ask, the question about being touched in those areas for other reasons. In retrospect, I wish I'd done it, because you might have produced a very different set of answers, probably including some, being held around the shoulders might be really good for people in the affiliative sense, whereas, obviously in the affiliative sense, being touched in the genitals is not. I also, in retrospect, wished that we'd asked about fetishes, the same set of 41 body parts in the fetishes, because I bet you get no correlation with the other ones. I bet you the feet are big winners in the world in the fetish world. So it's the usual answer with research. Once you've got the data in, you remember all the good questions that you wished you'd asked when you designed the original experiment. But thanks for the suggestion, Bob.
So presumably some adventurous neuroimager has had people sit in an MRI and become sexually aroused. So where lights up in terms of, does sensory cortex light up, or is it just deeper areas, or does everything light up, or?
Yeah. You'd be surprised at how adventurous neuroimagers aren't in this domain. But there was a paper published early this year, I've forgotten the names of the authors, and they demonstrated greater activation in genital-related areas when, that is in S1, when when the participant believed that the person touching them was an attractive member of the opposite sex for heterosexual men versus a pretty dull-looking member of the same sex for the same heterosexual men. A fact which rather undid us during the review process, if I remember painfully. I mean, it's a moot point, of course, about what's driving the process, because it might be that once you start to think the sexual thought for something that's driven subcortically, that the cortical variant then just lights up, because it just seems like you focus more on that part when someone you really care about is touching you there. But actually, I don't think people have done it, and if I had more time in my life, I would very much like to do it here. It's also quite tricky to do. I mean, last year when we were collecting these, or earlier this year when we were collecting these data, Vicky tried with a partner in the scanner in Brigantia to see which parts we could get to for the purposes of touching. And because of the design of scanners, when you go in from the south, as it were, it's very hard to get to the areas around the head without also touching the more southerly regions, which is a bit of a confound. So she then tried the opposite approach, which is to go in from the north end of the scanner. And she realized, unfortunately, that when you move yourself around in the scanner, you develop a substantial feeling of wooziness from moving in an electric field. So we kind of gave up on that one. I think it's doable. What I need is a collaborator who has more time than I do to be collecting the data. But I think it's a very interesting question. And one of the reasons that I wanted to give this talk now with these data was to see whether we should just throw this stuff out, having had it come back with mixed reviews from Cortex, or just put it out somewhere else, or whether it's worth persevering for another submission. So I'll be cornering Paul Downing at some stage to get some feedback on that question. But the answer is, just in the same way that people haven't studied it Kinsey-like, people don't seem to have done it well enough in the scanner, as far as I know. Paul's about to tell me that a great paper's been published. We couldn't find it when we went to.
I'm afraid I don't know that literature very well, but I'd be happy to look into it. But I was going to ask you, I just wanted to press you a bit on the foot fetish thing a little bit. I mean,
You can't even talk about it. People are smirking.
the fact that it's just so prevalent, it just seems, quite unlikely that all these people with a foot fetish, that there's kind of no relation to their own sort of bodily pleasure.
Yeah.
Which sort of seems to be what you're saying.
What is it about
it's
feet?
so unbalanced. It's just so non-random, right? And
Sure.
it's the feet that show
Yeah.
up so often.
Look, I really don't know why it's the feet. The only argument that springs readily to mind is one originally touted, and you won't be surprised by the analysts, which suggests that when you're young, you spend a lot of time in the lower parts of the world, and you see a lot more of feet and lower limbs than you do when you're older, and that turns out to be a especially interesting way of directly connecting with with the opposite sex parent. Probably in the case of men, especially with opposite sex, with women, and maybe with high heels, and who knows. But the literature on just exactly at what age you get primed for the sexual stimuli that you find interesting is a whole other question. The other issue in the foot fetish literature is that ways of differentiating between men and women will become especially salient. So men just don't wear high heels, or none of them in Bangor seem to wear those kinds of, So if you're interested in a marker for women, then stockings and heels and whatever. There is really, when you look at that paper on the topic, there are men who have fetishes for like strings of pearls, and earrings, and and lips especially. So I think it might well be that things that especially differentiate between the genders are strong there, and the lower limbs are a good proxy for that. But because women wear jumpers just as much as men do.
Right.
So it's
no jumper fetishes then.
There really were not. I couldn't see a one.
Yeah.
So.
So I'm trying to think about the relationship between S1 activity and sort of visual V1 activity, right? So in the visual system, you have these early areas that pick up basic features, and then you have higher level stuff. I guess my question is there anything like that going on here, specifically like in Penfield recordings? Were those stimulations, were they more like just a poke as opposed to a caress? Is there something about the nature of the activation, that it's not a single punctate activation, but it's actually a movement of activation in the neural space that actually could then lead to the arousal, something like that? And, well, I'll ask that question first.
I mean, I don't know. Firstly, Penfield didn't report his stuff nearly as systematically 60 years ago as we would like it now. I know there is a literature on, in fact, Francis McGlone is the world authority, for those of you who know Francis, who spends a lot of time in Bangor, on the speed with which a caress occurs. I think the answer is 5 centimeters per second or something is the optimal speed, and if you go too fast or too slow, you don't optimally activate a particular class of fiber, cutaneous fiber. What I don't know, and I had a discussion with him a couple of weeks ago on the topic, is whether those fibers are especially found in areas that are erogenous. He didn't seem to think so, you know. And for example, it's primarily supporting affiliative touch, and you get it in, you know, body parts that are good for affiliation. The arms are good for it. The shoulders are good for it. You know, anywhere the back of your head will be good for it. So they don't seem especially to map onto the erogenous zones. But it's an interesting thought, and it's certainly, if it were true, would produce those kinds of hardwired correlations that we that we saw there. But it's really those fibers, glabrous skin, are just as prominent here as there, and there's some kind of dividing line between those two, certainly for our participants. So I don't know. And the question about why fetishes seem to be so especially visual and so different, really, from this touch phenomenon seem quite striking. I don't think that men who have prominent foot fetishes also want their own feet touched. I think they're more or less indifferent whether their own feet are touched or not. They're no more interested than your average bloke. It's an entirely different class of stimulation, and I really think probably driven by experiences that happen later in life, by which I mean like puberty, onset of puberty. I suspect there's one good place you would look. You're starting to have sexual feelings about members of the opposite sex. You're looking for things that are markers for that and are highly correlated with those, and bingo, shoes or whatever else it is. So I don't know much about the S1 V1 connection.
I guess my other question, if I do one quick short one, tickles and erogenous, is there any overlap in sort of tickles and people who are tickling areas that are ticklish? I should know this.
To return to Bob's question, another good question I wished I'd asked if I was doing a more systematic survey. Armpits are very good for tickling. They didn't score especially highly in our erogenous zone category. So I don't know. I suspect if we'd gathered the data, there wouldn't be any especially strong correlation. And I don't know, by the way, why armpits and the back of the knee and so on, and the base of the soles of the feet especially do it for people. There is, of course, also the question about the speed of that action. If you touch the bottom of the feet slowly, it's an affiliative caress. Do it a bit faster, and it changes the nature of the experience. So I think it's different, and it's a very interesting question because we're slowly uncovering just exactly how diverse the number of sensory receptors in the skin are, and the way in which they mediate a whole different set of mediate a different set of sensory experiences. So it's an interesting one. We don't have the data. I wish I'd asked about tickling.
Okay, I think that's it.